Good morning, students. It's time for social science. This week we're going to learn about prehistory and ancient history. Do you remember our timeline of history? Say the 5 main periods. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We start with prehistory, ancient history, the Middle Ages, the modern age, and the contemporary age. This week we study the first 2, prehistory and ancient history. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we study prehistory, we study ancient history, but this week we don't study the last 3. We'll do that next week. Let's look at prehistory. So now our timeline is only in the first part, prehistory. It started millions of years ago with the first humans. It ended when humans started writing. That was about 5,000 years ago. Look at this picture. This is writing. It's not English or Spanish, it's called cuneiform, but it was a form of writing. We divide prehistory into the Stone Age and the Middle Ages. So here's prehistory. Let's draw a line to separate it into the Stone Age, depending on the tools they used. Look, here's a man with stone tools. And the Middle Ages. You see, they started to make metal tools. Now, let's look at the Stone Age. We divide the Stone Age into 2 parts, the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. Here's prehistory. Here's the line that separates the Stone Age from the Middle Ages. And now, in the Stone Age, another line. The Paleolithic. Here's a typical stone tool from the Paleolithic. And Paleolithic means old stone. It's simple. The Neolithic was later and different, and we call this new stone. Can you see the stone looks a little bit more polished and complicated and better? New tools, new stone. For your information, in the Middle Ages also, they made tools with metals like bronze and iron. Let's look at the Paleolithic, the first part of prehistory in the Stone Age. Some 3 basic ideas. Number 1, humans were nomads. What are nomads? They are people who didn't live in one place. They moved from place to find food and water. Humans discovered fire. Think about how important it was to have fire. For food, for protection, for light, for warmth. It was everything. And also, humans made cave paintings. And even today we can see some. That was the Paleolithic. Now let's look at the Neolithic that came after. In the Neolithic, humans stopped being nomads and they started living in communities with many homes together, living in larger groups. And most important, humans started farming, the activity of agriculture. Look at this picture. You can see a man with a dog. If you look carefully, you can see pigs and cows. These are domestic animals. And you can see some people who are farming to plant food. This way, they didn't need to move from place to place. Now, to finish about prehistory, I've included a video. This video is optional. You don't have to watch it, but you can. Now, can you see the hand? The letter A is for ancient history. Let's have a look. Now our timeline moves up, and this part is ancient history. It started when humans started writing. Remember this picture of cuneiform writing about 5,000 years ago. And it ended with the fall of the Roman Empire. So a few thousand years. What happened in ancient history? Well, here's one basic idea. It was a time of great civilizations. There were many, many civilizations all around the world that started forming. But in our book, they speak about 3. So I'll just mention these 3, but there are more. About 3100 BC, There was a civilization in Africa called the Egyptians. Now, the Egyptians had a system of writing called hieroglyphics. Can you see the pictures? They represented sounds or things or ideas. The Egyptians made mummies. For example, when a king or pharaoh died, they would prepare the body for the afterlife by making mummies. And of course, the Egyptians made the pyramids. Let's continue in ancient history. Let's look at another civilization. We know we had the Egyptians. Now, around 500 BC, another important civilization that came was the Greeks. They had a language too. We call it Ancient Greek. Here you can see it. Look at the letters. Very different, aren't they? You can't read this. The title is Odyssea. It's a famous story about a man named Odysseus, or Ulysses, who traveled around the sea to come back home after a war. The Greeks loved theater. Look at that theater that they built for thousands of people, and they told stories. Sometimes they were tragedies. Do you know who this person is? Zeus, the king, the father of all the gods. Just one example of Greek mythology, of the 12 gods who lived on Olympus and the heroes and these stories that we continue telling even today. And of course, the Greeks were the people who started the Olympic Games. This year, 2020, is a year of the Olympic Games. We continue them today, but unfortunately we can't because of the coronavirus. But next year we will continue this tradition that started with the Greeks. Well, in ancient history, we spoke about civilizations, about the Egyptians, the Greeks, and now one more. Around 218 BC, this civilization entered Spain. And it is the Romans. Look at Julius Caesar here. The Romans had a language too. It's called Latin. Probably you can read this because the letters are the same letters we use today. The Spanish language comes from Latin, from the Romans. They made many buildings, but maybe the most famous building was the Colosseum in Rome, where gladiators fought against wild animals and other gladiators to the death. The Romans also created an enormous empire that included all the territory around the Mediterranean Sea, and of course it included Spain. This empire continued for many centuries, but finally it fell, and that was the end of what we call ancient history. If you want to watch some more videos and find out more, you can watch these, but again, it's optional. So today you've learned about prehistory and ancient history. On our hand of 5 periods of history, prehistory, ancient history. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've learned about prehistory and ancient history, and we'll learn about the last 3 next week. Good job. Now it's time for you to do some activities to show that you know what you studied today. Prehistory and ancient history. Well, activity number 1, write about prehistory. You can see some words here: new, old, communities, nomads, fire, farming. And you have to put them in the correct place in the table. There's one part for the Paleolithic, one part for the Neolithic. In the Paleolithic, it says blah 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 stone tools. And in the Neolithic, blah 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 stone tools. So we need a different word. Do you remember? That's right. Paleolithic means old stone. And Neolithic means new stone. You write it in your notebook. In the Paleolithic, they were, the answer is nomads. Remember, that means that they moved from place to place to find food and water. But in the Neolithic, they started living in communities, larger groups with houses all together. And in the Paleolithic, they discovered fire and made cave paintings. And in the Neolithic, they started farming, agriculture. So now you know a little bit about prehistory. Did you remember the answers? I hope so. You write it in your notebook and remember. Activity 2 is about ancient history. It's similar. You look at these words and put them in the table. Greek, Latin, hieroglyphics, Colosseum, pyramids, theaters, the Roman Empire, the Olympics, and mummies. Let's say something about their language, something about the buildings they made, and something about their culture. Well, what was the language of the Egyptians? If you remember, it was called hieroglyphics. The Greeks, of course, had a language called Greek, ancient Greek. And the Romans, their language was not Roman, it was Latin. What buildings did they make? Well, the Egyptians made the pyramids. The Greeks made, for example, theaters. And the Romans made the Colosseum. And let's say one thing about their culture. We could say many, but just one word. For example, the Egyptians made mummies. And the Greeks were the people who started the Olympics. And the Romans started an empire that we call the Roman Empire, which continued for many years, and when finally it ended, this was the end of ancient history. You've finished your activities for social science for this week. Great job.